Hello, everyone. I'm Ian McCausland, and welcome to Creative Forces Conversation with Petr Cikhart, ACK. We wish to welcome everyone from around the globe that's watching this. We're going to have a conversation with Petr. I'm going to have a conversation with Petr. If you wish to ask questions, we're going to ask that you send them along with your while you're watching on YouTube. And I'm going to have Jeff Lee, our moderator in Able City, New York, to ask those questions to Petr as our conversation goes along. Please feel free to send those questions along. This is a conversation between Petr and myself, but it's also a conversation that we wish to have you participate in. So, Petr, first of all, thank you so much for joining us today. I wanted to start the conversation with going back into your early experiences when you moved to the United States. You were working primarily in documentaries in New York City. And the reason I wanted to have that conversation was because I wanted to have you discuss the lessons that you learned from working in documentaries about camera placement and composition.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's great to be here. First, I wanted to acknowledge that yesterday we lost Alan Davio, a great cinematographer. And I had the fortune to have him in one of my classes at AFI. And, he was a wonderful human being and also a wonderful cinematographer. So, I just wanted to say that because it's very sad news. But to sort of my beginnings at the documentary camera, I came to New York when I was in my early 20s. I think I was 21. A friend of mine just last week sent me this photo, and it has me on it with him and with Yoko Ono. I completely forgot. It's like from 1996. And, really, I just wanted to work in film because what was attractive to me was to tell stories. And I realized one day that if I wanted to have a job that always tells stories and always does something different, kind of every day was going to be different, film and television was a great medium to do it because every day is different and every time you can tell an interesting story. So when I came to New York, I think because people didn't think that I could speak English very well, I was sort of offered a job in sort of tech help, which was, being an AC, being a sound person, being, doing dubs of different videos. And I worked at this company called Global Vision with Danny Schechter, who ran Global Vision and who was the sort of force in independent news at the time. And I learned assisting. At that time, the crew was a cameraman, soundman / AC, and a producer. And I followed these great cameramen like Sam Shin and Gary Griffin for 2 or 3 years and watched them work. And it really was an interesting lesson because what I realized quickly was that you could tell stories by visuals and by the camera. And visual storytelling it kind of opened my eyes to what a camera can do and how it can work in a way that it tells stories, where it doesn't just have to be what people write, doesn't just have to be what people say, but how you photograph what is happening is just as important. Or at least for me, it was incredibly interesting. So I sort of dove into it. And a few years after working, for these guys and following them around, I started to shoot on my own, mostly at that time documentaries.
And what sort of things, when you put that camera to your shoulder for the first time, when you looked at an eyepiece and you're doing a documentary, what sort of things kind of informed you of your composition choice, and what things kind of did you learn in that sort of moment where everything is unfolding in real time and it's not a narrative, it's something you have to capture? I'm just curious what you translated from the experience of those other DPs into your own work.
Well, I think the interesting thing about documentaries, until today, it's a really interesting way to experience the world. You're really experiencing a raw, unedited, real world, particularly if you're doing very tight documentaries, which is what I did most of the time. And as a cinematographer, oftentimes you have to make split decisions to decide how you're going to tell this story. So, you enter a room, something is happening. There could be one person, two people, or a whole bunch of people. And you have to kind of figure out where's the light coming from, where to put the camera, to make sure that once you establish a line or once you get to a certain place and start telling the story from a certain angle, that it's going to work. You have to make sure that the producer or the director have a safe place to be, so they don't get in the shots. It's really on you; it's not on them. I have to identify what the story is, who the players are, and how you can tell that story in order for the editor then to have the material to tell it. And in documentaries, there are sort of two things. There's one is to technically be able to tell the story of what's happening, and then there is another level that I learned after a while, and it took me some time, which is how to photograph emotions. And I have been fortunate to be in some really kind of crazy or emotional situations. I've been climbing a mountain on Everest with a bunch of blind teenagers who didn't make it to the top. And how did they deal with that emotionally at 21,000 feet? I've been in situations where guns were pulled on me, knives were pulled on people in front of the camera, and you have to sort of decide, like, what do I do? Do I keep shooting? Do I not? How do I shoot it? How do I tell the emotion? How do I tell the story? Where do I sort of put myself in that place? And how do you translate what you're experiencing as a human being through the camera, so the viewers can have that same experience? That's kind of, it's hard to even teach that, but it's a really interesting part of shooting documentaries.
Exactly, it's just something experience teaches you and you bring it with you. So I'm curious how you translated that sensibility once you had the experience of a while capturing documentary footage, having the technical, having the aesthetic, knowing what you needed to do to get the story done. How do you feel that has translated into your work as a narrative cinematographer?
Yeah, I mean, certainly it has done two things. It has done the fact that I can sort of recognize how to tell a story relatively fast. From just kind of entering a location and realizing what would work and what wouldn't, because my brain is just so trained to be able to make those decisions really fast. And I think generally, I have a sort of a relatively naturalistic style, and I can work with a lot of natural light. And also, I think a friend of mine once, one of my gaffers said, like, your style is you're always sort of discovering something. You're always looking for whatever is the next thing. So I think there is a sense of discovery in my cinematography, even in fiction cinematography. And I think that comes from documentaries. I think technically, of course, you're able to work with much smaller crew, with much less money, with much less resources. But when you come to narrative, it's so interesting because, the driving force between a narrative film is the script and the story, and everything follows the script. And so as a cinematographer, then you have this chance to sort of have a blank canvas and decide, how do I tell the story of the script in a visual way, which in documentaries you don't have. It's, you're going by instinct, you're going by experience, and you're just trying to capture it the best way you can. So, I really embraced the fiction world, and was like, oh my God, this is amazing. I can really, start painting here. It's still following the same stories and the relationships between the characters and all of that, but you actually can create a language and tell the film together with the director and with all of your crew that best conveys those emotions and the story that happens in the film.
I want to discuss your time at American Film Institute, which you just alluded to. And while you were at AFI in Los Angeles, you mentioned to me that one of your instructors put forth this idea that I want to talk about with you today because I think it's a really interesting way of looking at light, not only from a practical and a technical standpoint, but also from sort of an aesthetic point of view as well. And the word that you used, which really struck me, was struggle. I want to ask you about that in a couple different ways. And first of all, what does that mean to you, and how does that influence the way you light? Without getting into technicalities, I'm just kind of interested in getting your conceptual and your aesthetic idea of what's that notion of struggle of light is for you.
Right. Yeah, one of my teachers at AFI, I think it was Bill Dill, he said, the light has to struggle to reach its object, and I absolutely believe that. I think the lighting that you use in film is just a tool to tell the story and to photograph the characters and more importantly the relationships between the characters that are in the film. And life is not as simple as something hitting you right in the face. There are obstacles and there are struggles and there are things that you have to overcome in order to achieve what you want. And so, the way I use the light is, I try to always mirror whatever is going on with the story. And struggling, by struggling, I mean, I usually like to use bigger lights that are farther away, that look natural, but I like to send them through things. I like to put them behind a tree, and then there is a window and a window frame and maybe a strange branch that just happened to be there, and a lamp and all of that. And by the time it gets to the character, it actually has a texture of real life. So, yeah, I think the struggle of the light should mirror the struggle of the character that happens to be in the film. Then I was shooting once, and I made everything too dark, and one of my co-DPs said, "Well, you don't want the audience to struggle seeing the face of the person you're filming." So it kind of goes both ways.
When you approach that, so let's take an example of you're shooting a scene and the dominant light, the motivating light, is coming from windows on one side of the room, for example. How are you approaching to get that light to fall in through that window, into that room in such a way? What type of lamps do you prefer to use, and what kind of gaffing type of considerations are you using to achieve that sort of naturalistic light that you want to convey?
Well, I think number one, what you have to do, the light should be justified based on where you are and based on the story. So let's say you are in a room and you do see that there's a big window on one side. I'll usually just try to use that window as the place where the light is coming from. If there is a little lamp or something like that, and it's a night scene, the light might be coming from that little lamp. Let's say it is a window, but I need to wrap it around to where there is no physical window. I could do a book light, or I could put up a big light outside that I don't see, and then bounce it off of something behind me. Usually I'll use, let's say for a big light, I'll use an M40. Through diffusion, I like to use light grit. I might put, depending on what color I want, maybe I'll put quarter straw. Sometimes I cool it down. And I try to find things that are sort of natural. So if there's a tree or there's a building that I can bounce it off rather than send it directly to kind of come into the room, I would rather do that than to just kind of use the light. And then it's really just looking at the details and adjusting it by the actors. Most of the time, well, not most of the time, a lot of times what we do with my gaffers is we kind of light a world and a space that the actors can move freely in. I don't I mean, I do sometimes do marks, but a lot of times I like to give actors the freedom to move, because I think movement is a big part of telling the story, and it's both movement of the actors and movement of the camera. So if I can create the lighting that's really interesting and they can move through it, I think that gives them a chance to perform their art. Because I think as cinematographers sometimes we forget that the actors are doing something incredibly difficult, and they need to have the space and the peace to be able to do what they do. One of my teachers said, actors are not furniture. And I follow that every time I'm on set. You can't just pick them up and move them because it's more convenient for you.
I'm curious with this struggling of light. This idea was brought to you, was presented to you at AFI, but you've kind of taken that and made it your own. And I'm wondering, it made such an impression on you. What is the reaction that you're trying to get from the audience going through the mechanics of this lighting style versus doing a more traditional sort of direct light approach through diffusion, going directly into the window kind of thing? And in other words, what do you think this is trying to communicate with that style versus a more traditional approach?
Well, I think all along, I think it's not just lighting. I do a very thorough prep, and that's one of the things I learned at AFI is that you have to take the script and you really have to understand the script. I mean, I put some scripts. I have tons of notes in my scripts from before, and I think it's really important for not just the cinematographer but also for the crew to really know what the film is about and what the characters are, how they feel, what their emotions are, and how they relate to each other. And once I figure out what that is, then I can sort of start to make rules about how those should be filmed. And usually you make that with directors, and you do research and past references, which can be movies, it can be paintings, it can be photographs, it can be music, it could be experiences, books, whatever it is. So I think once you understand with all that research, once you understand who these characters are, why they're there, what are their obstacles, what are their relationships, then you can make a plan. And the plan can be lighting, it can be movement, it can be what kind of shape you want to shoot it in, contrast, what the color is, what is the tone, the texture. And with all of those sorts of tools of the cinematographer to convey what is really going on. Like, you have to put it not just to record what's going on, but to show the audience what is really going on. And so every decision, including the lighting, will then go back to me trying to show the audience the emotion of what the character is experiencing. And with my gaffers, I don't necessarily say, like, I need you to put this type of light outside. I would rather say, can this be like a rainy November in New England? Because that tells particular emotion. Or can this look like a French Riviera summer? Because that says a very different thing. And then I usually let them come up with a plan, and then we go over it and figure out how it works and how it doesn't. And usually I come up with something much better than I would have come up with.
I'm curious, for those that have been watching your work, and also in your journey as a cinematographer, you mentioned when we've talked about this notion of an arc to a reading a script, understanding the story, understanding the emotional motivations of characters, and you mentioned to me this notion of two different arcs. One is the arc of light, and the other one is the arc of color. Mm-hmm. And to me, that is the result of a lot of time and knowledge and sort of lessons learned. And what I'd like is if you could sort of discuss that process, what that means to you, particularly for cinematographers who are just starting out their journey and are trying to understand the concept of understanding that cinematography is a journey through a narrative and what your influence on that narrative is.
So let me see. I was trying to. I have a light set up here, and I was thinking, I could turn it off and show the difference. There would be a big difference in the way I look without a fill light or the way I look, with it. But I think what's important as when we approach a story is to sort of come up with what you want it to be and come up with rules, because one type of color, for example, is going to mean something if it repeats itself through the movie. There's something about rules of threes. Once you see it once, you see something very blue once, it doesn't really mean that much. You see it second time, you go and like, oh, okay. You see it for the third time, blue means something. And blue could mean sadness, it could mean happiness, it could mean excitement, it could mean love. Probably with lighting, contrasty lighting usually means more drama. Softer lighting means more comedy. But if you set up those rules and follow them through the film and understanding what they are, I think the audience will buy it. The audience will then understand the emotion. So again, I don't just sort of go like, well, I want it to be blue because it's going to be really cool. I want it to be blue because it's going to mean something in that story. And then I follow it, I follow that pattern until it changes. I think with Tamara, what we did was, that film was sort of divided into 3 different parts. And it was, it was about a man who really wants to be a woman and then goes through a surgery and becomes a woman. And the first part of the film is sort of a young man that has a lot of ideals, but realizes quickly that he has to just live the normal life and get married and be the lawyer that everybody wants him to be. And that's the second part. And the third part is when he actually gets away and has the surgery and becomes a woman. And all of that film followed this sort of curve in how he as a personality, how he as a character saw the world around him. So, in the beginning, it was sort of like happy-go-lucky. I was shooting somewhere around at 4. The lights were pretty natural and normal. In the middle, I went down to like a 2, and everything was soft around him. He couldn't really see the world because it was sort of in this bubble that he didn't want to be in. The lighting became much colder. There was a lot more contrast in it because he was very conflicted at that time. Once, the irony of the story was that once he became a woman, he was completely alone because everyone had walked away from him. But my lighting wasn't reflecting what everybody else was thinking about him. It was reflecting how he felt because he was finally liberated. So I actually shot the whole third of that movie at like an 8 because I wanted to see what the world is, what he sees. And finally everything opened up and the colors were warmer and prettier and the lighting was a bit softer. And so I think it all sort of flows with what your character or characters are going through. And I don't know if there is any rules. The one rule maybe that I would say is nothing should be arbitrary. Nothing should be generic. As long as you make a decision, you stick with it, and you have a plan, then you're good. Just don't make the decisions because it's cool or because somebody told you that it would be cool or they saw something somewhere. Make a decision based on what's in the story and justify it by your research and by talking to the director and by the paintings that you see at a gallery. Before every movie, I have done a lot of movies on locations, and I always take time the weekend before. Usually it's off because everybody settles down to get ready. and I will go spend the day or the 2 days in the local museum, whatever museum it is or gallery. And then I will just soak in the paintings, and it sort of settles me into what I'm about to do. And I take a couple of pictures of the paintings, and then I feel like this is where I want to go. And every time you question yourself on set, you can go back to your research or to that painting or to that movie and say, no, wait a second, this is where I want to be.
I'd like you to discuss with us the relationship you have with your gaffer. And what is that relationship about, not just from a technical standpoint, but what's important to you about how you communicate with one another, or what's important for them to communicate back? In other words, how have you created those relationships with gaffers where you can really trust them to say, I want this, I want that. I've got a follow-up question to it, but first, how do you create that relationship with a gaffer, and how do you know instinctually that the communication is happening?
Well, I don't think it's just the gaffer. I think as a DP, you are, you're kind of the leader of a crew. And the crew could be anywhere from 2 on a, on a small little project to 50 or 100. And I always try to make a point that everyone on my crew is really involved and feels welcome with their ideas and with their thoughts, and are invested in being there. So, I always send a script to everyone, and I really hope that everybody reads it, even though I know, some people don't. But I like to know, I like people to know why they're there and what we're trying to do. And, when it comes to the relationship with the key members of the crew, like a gaffer, like a key grip, or my AC, I'm very open about what we want to do, and I'm always asking them for suggestions and for things that they think. I don't usually make specific demands about what exactly is the light that I want them to put up, or what exactly is the focus that should be in the scene. I like people to have creative freedom and feel like they're contributing to what we're doing. And like I said before, I try to speak in language that's more universal rather than specific, so they have the freedom to make those specific choices. Because I think as a DP, or the biggest strength that we have as DPs is to hire people who are much better at their jobs than you would ever be. And it just makes the production better and makes your work better, because fantastic gaffers and grips and dolly grips just make, they know much better than you do. So that's my approach.
Basically, if you can give them an overall description and kind of let them go with the technicalities, kind of thing.
Yeah, of course. And then then you look at it together. So let's say,
let me give you an example. Let's say if you were working with a gaffer and you say, I want the look of happiness, or I want the look of concern or sadness. Like, what, in your mind, what are you trying to achieve with an overall statement like a look of happiness or something like that? And how is that translating to the gaffer? Can you, in other words, you just letting them run with their technical, and you just have an idea in your head?
Yeah, I usually have an idea. I mean, let's say, we want to photograph happiness. So I figured it's probably some kind of a soft backlight that's warm. That's relatively well filled from the front. We probably want to see the eyes, because they should be happy. So I will see what the gaffer comes up with. Maybe they'll say, okay, well, let's put 2 sky panels outside with sort of double framed diffusion in front, and then they'll put the actor kind of in a way where you still see the sort of sparkle of the window behind. And then what do we use for the front? It could be a b-board. It could be a muslin with another light in the front. I always like to use park ends that come kind of from far away and again sort of struggle to get in. But what I like about them is that they're kind of unpredictable. They land on a table, on a floor, and then kind of bounce and reflect and do things that you wouldn't normally expect. And so you talk about the plan, exactly what the plan is. And, sometimes I'm like, I don't know, but, let's try it. And oftentimes it's like, oh, you were totally right. It worked so good. Or sometimes, you have to know what you want. And sometimes you have to be firm and say, look, this doesn't work for me. You need to either not do it or switch it around a little bit. And usually you realize that your ideas are actually kind of on a very similar place. And even if you don't like something, the adjustment is very small. And it doesn't take too long. There was one interesting lesson that I learned at AFI was one of my teachers said about lighting. When you think you're perfectly lit, turn off one of the lights. And I genuinely do that because, also these days it's, the cameras are so good and the latitude is so good, you really don't need much. So it's become less about putting big lights and lighting. It's become more about shaping the light and creating a texture with the light the way that it comes in and hits the subjects. And, the key grip becomes instrumental in that world. Whether it's reflections, whether it's mirrors, whether it's little cookies, whether it's making stuff up from, branches or pieces of wood, or coming up with sort of interesting, weird ways how the light can get in and reflect and bounce. And, whether it's, putting a little piece of cellophane in front of the actor's face, or I've shot scenes in a bedroom where the gaffer would just put tiny little strips of LED lights, and they put that kind of hid them in the bed sheet. So when the actors turned the bed sheets around, it would sort of give her this little light. You didn't even know where it was coming from, but it was the sort of texture that we were after.
Curious about, I'll change the subject slightly, and I want to go back to Tamara. And it's a film I want to reference with you for a couple of points of conversation. I want to point out, we're going to show the trailer to tomorrow, but I would encourage you to go look at Peter's website, because he's got clips there from projects he's worked on, and a great reference to really understand how he lights and composes things. I want to talk about tomorrow first, in your relationship, and you've already kind of touched on this slightly, the relationship of focus to the narrative. But before we get into that, I think what would be nice to do is to take a look at the trailer for tomorrow, and then we'll come back and have a conversation about that. So if we could roll the trailer, please.
Okay.
Yo lo que veo es a un señor vestido de traje y corbata, que es padre de familia, que se comporta y se viste como un hombre.
No estás bien. Vive tu vida.
¿Me llevas?
Sube.
El profesor Almanza ha logrado dividir a sus alumnos y ponerlos a pelear.
regodeándose egocéntricamente en eso de mostrarse como es.
¿Me va a ayudar con esto, sí o no?
La pierna. Hola, profe. Hombre, qué bella.
Escúchame, Tommy.
So I'm going to use tomorrow as a reference for a couple of things. But right now, let's just talk about your choices on focus. And also, I'd like to talk about your relationship with your first or your focus puller, because obviously those are individuals who are bringing that scene and their choices of focus transition, how they're creating focus. I would like you to talk about, first of all, what your intention was as that story developed in terms of how you used your stop to help tell that story.
Yeah, it's what we talked about before with the lighting and the contrast. I mean, I try to, just like with the color of sort of going from the neutral to the colder to the warmer, I use the depth of field in the same way. By the end of the film, I tried everything to be focused around Tamara, because finally this woman was able to come out of her shelf and be who she wanted to be. It didn't matter that she was all alone and everybody hated her, but she could see clearly who she wanted to be. And so, I used an 8 or an 11, which was kind of crazy at the time. It was like, what? We're shooting? Oh, okay. Through the middle of the story, when at that time he is living with a wife and 2 kids in a situation, and is a successful lawyer in a place where he doesn't really want to be. We use a very shallow depth of field to make it feel disconnected, and we also used framing in an interesting way to make sure that he's always kind of framed out. I remember there was an office scene where he's leading this meeting, and we framed it in a way where you just see him by himself in a door, and then the big window was everybody else in the office. And, it just makes you feel like he's completely alone against everybody else. And when it comes to the focus puller, yeah, I mean, it's, they're artists. They're people who understand the story and can create the same emotion that you're creating with your lighting, your contrast, with your shape, your tone. They can create with focus. And, of course, they have to know the script and the story. And, I love when they take initiative. Sometimes you get into trouble because the director is like, oh, what did you do? But sometimes they discover, beautiful things that you would never really know. I think one of my kind of mottos, or one of the things that I really enjoy is photograph the things that are not being said. And focus is essential to that, because you have to be in sync with your focus puller. That's what you're doing. And sometimes we sneak in a couple of shots before the take, and sometimes we let the camera roll after the take. Because body language, posture, footstep, breath, the way people react to what they're being told, those are oftentimes more interesting than what is actually being said in the text. Of course, you have to get the text, but that's how you capture those emotions. That's how, the way people fidget with their hands, or the way their eyes are, or where they look during a conversation, or the way they fidget with their feet, or the way they walk. All of those are expressions that help us understand what the character is doing. And when the director gives me the freedom to find those moments, the focus puller has to be right there with you to capture every single little bit that you want, and to give it a flow that's artistic and makes sense for the story. So having a good focus puller is a reward. It's amazing.
So I think it's wonderful that you kind of make those statements, because I think that a lot of times people view the camera assistants as just very technological oriented parts of the crew. Obviously, they need to be on their technical prowess to keep the production going, but it's also an intuition, isn't it? It's a understanding where you're going with your thoughts creatively and matching that. Do you find that is really with the focus puller? It's an unspoken relationship between you and the focus puller, isn't it? That really makes that intuitive choices in the moment really work.
Yeah, I have a particular style. I don't use it all the time, but a lot of times at least in my early days in fiction, because I think of my documentary background, I would oftentimes shoot in a way where I didn't really know where the camera was going to be when I was capturing the scenes. The actors would act out, and then we would sort of get it as we needed to, and sort of shoot in this very, very handheld, naturalistic way. And I wouldn't make it easy for the focus pullers, because they would be like, "Well, what are you shooting?" And I'm like, "I don't know. Just be on your toes, get ready." And so it's a symbiotic relationship. You really have to be together. Like in the old days, the sound man used to be connected by cable to the camera. It's the same way, except there is no cable anymore. And of course, technically, I rely on my AC, my first AC, my second AC to know the camera better than I do, and know the menus, and be able to quickly go from one setting to another and all of that. And they're busy staff.
Do you go through the script with them, or do you ask them to read the script beforehand?
Yeah. I send the script to every member of the crew. Try to talk to people about it. Certainly the gaffer, certainly the focus puller, about what the scenes are that we're shooting and why are we there, and what they mean. Yeah,
sure,
that's important.
I wanted to talk about lenses for a little bit. Too much specific lenses per se, but kind of the knowledge you've gained over time about lenses. And one of the interesting things that you've mentioned is that the sensation or the experience of a choice of a lens is almost a tactile experience. You've equated it to almost having your hand run over different surfaces. And you kind of mentioned that when we've spoken, that there's the experience of your hand running over the texture of tree bark, and there's the experience of your hand running over glossy paper. And I just thought that was a really interesting way to think about how lenses are capturing images and putting them onto our sensors. And one of the key word that really came out of that was this notion of texture. And I think that's interesting. I would like you to kind of expand on that, because as you know, there are so many choices of lenses now. And not only do we have, I feel like every 6 months there's a new set of lenses cinematographers to work with, but we're also at this moment in history where we're not only looking at the technical accomplishments of what we can have at state-of-the-art now, but there's also this desire to use lenses that are, decades old. And sometimes things that we have thought about as imperfections are precisely the things that we want to tell a story. So the first part of that is, can you kind of expand on your notions of how you came to that word of texture to have a conversation about a lens choice?
Texture is, there's no question that lenses contribute to the texture of our films in a tremendous way. I think texture is a really interesting concept, and it's kind of a mysterious concept because it's really hard to touch. You can't quantify it. You can't really put your finger on exactly what it is. I try to think about what texture my films are, and it goes back to the story. And like you said, there's a very different texture if I close my eyes and I picture myself running my hands over a wall or a tree bark or a glossy piece of paper or a glass. And what does that feel? And which one of those is my film? And then you can do tests and test a whole bunch of lenses and figure out which one of those the lens is. I mean, in the same way, I had some directors who would send me music and say, this is the song, or this is the composition of a classical music. This is how I see the film. And so you can close your eyes and sort of think like, okay, that is the emotion that this is bringing out in me. And how do I translate that technically in my choices of, let's say, lenses? Because every time you do that, whenever you're questioning yourself on set, if you have multiple lens choices on set, or if you're talking about how I'm going to light it, you can always go back to that. You can always, even on set when everything is so busy and everybody is out of time and money and there is no time for even 1 second, and you cannot absolutely add the flag because that will put us behind and we'll go into overtime and we can never do that. You can always close your eyes and say, wait a second, it's the tree bark. Okay, let's make the decision that we'll go with that because that was my initial plan that could have been 2 months ago. And it works because you can always center yourself and make sure that you have an answer, because you always have to have an answer when you're MVP. And you can move on and you don't delay anyone because everyone is waiting and it costs a lot of money for you to delay them. I think that's kind of how I view texture. And it's not specific, but it helps you go forward. And what was the other part of your question? Sorry.
Okay. Well, it's just part of that was just understanding that. So, are there certain characteristics of lenses that you can qualify with different textures? So, let's go back to the analogy of bark or glass, things like that. Inherently, and we can also use the analogy of music. There's a relationship of how many beats per increment to the emotional state that music puts you in. More beats is going to be a conflict. It's just more. Whereas, tougher beat, less beats. So, in your mind, how do you equate specific characteristics of lenses to that texture feeling?
Yeah, so for example, now with full frame, there are really amazing lens choices. I've been using the Cooke S7s a lot. They kind of have, to me, they have kind of a warmer feeling. They're kind of a little more alive. I've also used I haven't used full frame signature primes, but I've used master primes a lot and ultra primes, and particular master primes they invoke a little bit of a colder feeling in me. I feel like I'm kind of seeing things through a little bit of a bluish glass, or I'm touching sort of a glass. I feel like I'm more like in a hospital, and it's sort of this colder, more take a deep breath setting, where the Cookes are a little more exhale and relax and look at the sort of leaves of a fall tree. I've used the Leicas quite a bit. They are, they're kind of very sharp, and and I usually put some filters in front, but to me, they're kind of realistic. And I like that sometimes. So, whatever the choice is, some of them flare differently than the others. But again, I think the lenses should be chosen. We talked about flare yesterday, which is a big characteristic of.
I was going to bring that up next. So yeah, go ahead and.
The lenses should be chosen based on what you're trying to tell with the story, and not because they look cool, or not because there's they flare in a really cool way, because maybe in one part of the movie your character is incredibly sad, and half an hour later they're on top of the world because they've overcome all the obstacles. Yeah. Do you really want to be the flare the same both times, or do you want to be specific on how you tell that story using the lens or the flare or the bokeh, or how does it mold and all of that. For example, in Against the Sun, if I remember right, it's a few years ago. I think we shot that on ultra primes, but because there's an interesting thing. There are objects in your film that become characters. So, for example, in Against the sun has become a character. It became one of the characters of the film because 20 days into them being stranded on a life raft in the middle of the Pacific, the sun was about to kill them, and they were dehydrated. They didn't have anything to drink. It was hot. They were completely sunburned and all of that. So what we did was we brought colors that we decided flared the way we really wanted them to flare in the high noon. And for that part of the movie, we used those lenses to push the narrative of how hot it is and what the sun was doing. And then it rained, and we went back to being, not having that flare anymore, because the characters felt like, oh, there's water. So now we went to sort of lenses that look a little bit flatter. So I think, again, making the choice and not being arbitrarily just because it looks cool is sort of where I go with my lens choices.
So when you're working on a project, you don't necessarily follow a rule of, I'm going to stick with these lenses through the entire show. I'm going to bring elements in as needed to direct the story where it needs to go.
Yeah, definitely. And you have, it's a fine line, because you don't really want the audience to notice that you're doing that. I personally never thrive towards the audience walking out to talk about how amazing the shots were, or the lenses look cool, or the crane moves were fantastic, or they went through the camera through a window and then over there, and how did they do that? I don't think the audience should think about it. I think the audience should walk away and say, wow, I really feel what it's like to be in a man's body and want to be a woman. And I really feel the struggle that person had to go through. Or in Conrad and Michelle, I feel what it's like to want to commit suicide when I'm 16 years old. And that's the conversation I would like people to have when they walk out of the movie theater, not about the fancy shots that I did.
I'm really glad that you brought up Conrad and Michelle, because that's a great sort of transition to the next thing I want to talk to you about. And that is, there's a couple of elements to that conversation. But at the heart of it, I want you to discuss what you feel is the minimum amount of light that you can use nowadays to get your idea across. And part of that conversation has a direct correlation or direct link to Conrad and Michelle, because I believe you used the Sony Venice for that. Yeah. And am I correct? It's that was one of the first projects that used it with the very high native ISO. Yeah?
I think it was the first or one of the first narrative films shot on the Venice. It was, I think we started in April 2018. And literally the camera came to Keslow in a box and we unpacked it and put it in the prep bay. And like 4 or 5 days later, we were shooting, and it was so new that even the 2500 ISO wasn't really approved to be used. Phil Squires at Sony actually kind of gave us the green light to use it because it was a Sony production. He's saying like, look, it's not officially approved, but I will tell you that it's going to work and it's going to be amazing. And so we used the Venice on Conrad and Michel.
So I think before we delve into that conversation, it would be nice to look at some footage from that project. So let's go ahead and take a look at the trailer for Conrad and Michel, please.
Are you seriously going to try? Because I don't want to seem like a fool. When are you doing it?
Can I have raspberry cha-cha with almond joy? Wait, sorry, no, and frozen pudding.
I'm gonna get the double death by chocolate. I'm going for broke here.
All right, if you want sprinkles, raise your hand.
Me.
You always want to keep the lighthouse 5 degrees up the bow as you pass the last buoy.
Oh, got it.
An atom is, the less energy it has. They feel more stable when they're out of that's all power.
Don't be scared. You're going to heaven, babe, but I'm going to hell. The devil told me I see him all the time. Some of my friends didn't act how I thought they were gonna act towards me, but I liked my outfit, and I know you did too, babe. I'll make sure all the boys want me. I'm yours for life, though. Always remember that.
So I think that's a pretty amazing example of what you've done with little to no light. I'm just curious, when you were first of all, those really low light shots in that, what was your stop on your lens? And do you know relatively like how many foot candles you were even producing to get that image?
I think we were at a 2, and we used the 2500 ISO. And what I remember was we worked with my gaffer, Matthew Lipton, and I would be in these rooms because, a lot of the part of the story was Bella Thorne on her phone in her bedroom in the middle of the night. And what we realized was that the phone was actually producing so much light, we needed to dim it all the way down. So what we would do, we would create sort of this base of the outside of the light that we wanted it to be in the windows. And then we would sort of let the phone play, and then we would augment a little bit with the lights inside. And that's when the little strips of LED lights inside the sheets would come into play. But what I remember is sort of looking away from the camera, and it was so dark, I couldn't see anything. And then I would even look through the viewfinder, and I was like, oh my God, it's just so dark. And I would call on the walkie, and Matthew would be with the DIT, with Nick in the tent, and I would be like, guys, I think this is too dark. We need to do something. And they would call back and say, no, don't touch it. It looks amazing. It's beautiful. and sort of it was my introduction to the Venice and to the 2500 ISO and what it could do. I mean, it literally, I feel like it sees better than your eye.
And I'm curious, what was the reaction to the colors when they got that? First of all, did you shoot that in RAW, or was it?
We shot that in the OCN codec,
okay.
which is a great codec, I think. It's codec that's very close to RAW, but it doesn't eat nearly as much space as RAW. So, if you're shooting any kind of a movie that is concerned about a budget, it's a really good codec. I know there is the LT, which I never use, but the standard is quite good. And I think there's a high quality. I usually end up with the standard, and it produces a great image.
And I'm really curious, what was the conversation like when your colorist got that footage? Were you a little concerned, or what was their reaction when they saw it?
No, they loved it. The colorist, at that movie, I had the colorist in attend, sort of, adjusting our LUT. We had a LUT that we designed before that was kind of a LUT that came from my F55 LUTs, and then we adjusted it to what we wanted to look. And I think what we did was, I think we had 3 different ones. I think we had one for happiness, sadness, and sort of normal life. Mm-hmm. And we would switch between the 3 LUTs. Depending on what the emotional arc was at that moment of the movie. And then he would then adjust every shot in the tent as we were shooting to send it over to the video village. So, the LUT didn't necessarily apply exactly where I wanted to be, which is why I was worried it was too dark. But then once he adjusted it in his coloring tent, it actually produced an image.
So it was one of the situations where literally you thought it was too dark in the eyepiece, but they're like, no, keep going.
Hey. And once it got to actual color, we used the colors very very similar to what we created on set. Actually, we didn't go too far. It looked already quite good from what we were able to achieve on set.
Okay, so we're going to shift gears a little bit here. So we've talked about your narrative work and your documentary work. I want to talk about your experience working on The Amazing Race. And for those who aren't familiar with this is it's an episodic television program. And essentially what happens with this is you have a cast and a crew who literally moves around the world from country to country on this quest. And so I wanted you to kind of speak to that experience. And first of all, what camera did you use for it? Which camera were you shooting with on that, Peter?
I've done many seasons of Amazing Race, I think 25. In the beginning, I used to run with the teams, which is basically, each of those teams have a crew of 2 who follow them around the world. And for the past, I think 5 seasons or 6 seasons, I have been shooting the host, Phil Kogan. And, what we do, we kind of create these little films about each one of the locations or the challenges that the contestants have to go through, and sort of explain either the location or the process or what do they have to do. And, I think we have to fit them in about 30 seconds. So actually this last season that we were just shooting, for the first time I brought the Venice because I asked Phil if he would like to look really great and if he would like me to get a Venice. And he said, yeah, that sounds good. So we got the Venice and brought it on the road with us. And, it's a little bit of a bigger camera. So there were some concerns about the size and the weight. And, we move very quickly. We have to set up. We do have some resources. We usually have a lighting person. We have a slider. Sometimes we have a crane. So, there are things that are in our disposal. But we have to come to a location, make a really quick plan, and then execute it because the race never stops. It's completely real. Nobody ever stops the contestants. So nobody will wait for us. So if we don't get it done on time, we are not getting it at all. And so there were some concerns like, we're bringing the Venice. We've always brought prime lenses, but we'll try it now and we'll see how it goes. But it actually worked fantastically because it's a really versatile camera. It can see in really low light. So, we would do these scenes in like a dark park, which before you just couldn't really do. But at the 2500, we would bring like one little light and stand next to a street lamp and it would actually look really nice. And we were able to do things naturally and quickly. The fact that you can go in increments of 0.3 steps on the ND is, super helpful because you're very fast, getting the enough ND in front of your lens or behind the lens to make sure that you get what you want. We've also used the, because we kind of bring limited amount of lenses. I don't have, 10 lenses. I only bring 3, and then we switch them around. But we use the feature on where you can put the E-mount lens. You take the pure mount off, and you can put an E-mount lens, a still lens. And I have a 12 millimeter still lens that we use on the E-mount, which becomes like an 8, or I think a little more than an 8. And it would produce in full frame, it would produce these stunning images. So yeah, we use that camera in a really versatile and fast way, and it worked out fantastically. We also had a zoom lens for some of the things where we really just had to kind of run and be mobile and build the camera in a handheld way that allowed that pretty well.
That lends itself to this idea that you spoke to me about, that I thought was really interesting and important for DPs who are just starting their career. And that idea was that you need to know how fast you need to be. Mm-hmm. And I'd like you to just kind of expand what you mean by that, so that cinematographers who are just starting out kind of understand that concept and their relationship to the rest of the crew and to the requirements, the time requirements and restrictions on a production.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think time. I think being a cinematographer kind of breaks into 3 different parts, and they're represented kind of equally: technical, artistic, and then people skills. And it's really important to, at least for me, it's really important to understand the sort of people skills part, and the fact that you're part of this bigger machine and then the bigger thing. And at the end, the story, the screenplay, and the acting are the most important things in order to tell your story. And there is a crew of many people, hundreds, 150 people who are there to achieve the goal of what the script is saying and what the actors are there to do. And so, I think sometimes we get caught into thinking we're the most important thing there, and without us, sort of, it can't happen, and it has to be perfect and as good as I decided it would be, and if it's not, then it's the end of the world. And I think it's important to understand the setup of the bigger picture and make your plan, and hopefully make your plan well ahead of time, so you don't get into a situation where you're on set trying to make a decision that really you could have made 2 weeks ago. Because if you're sitting on set making that decision now, you're slowing everybody down, and it doesn't really work. So I try to plan my days. I try to plan what I want to do, what's really important, and again, it goes back to your preparation. Because if you're really prepared, then you do silly little graphs about character relationships and objectives and subjectives, and I like to, one of my directors always does, who are our friends, who are our enemies, who are the spectators in the movie, who matter, who don't. You do these little things way ahead of time. By the time you are in the middle of the battle, you can go back to them. Yeah, I always have my script with me on the AC card, and if I'm not sure, I just go back to it, and I go back to the basics, and then you're able to come up with a solution. And it's also important to understand the setup of, everybody always says, "Oh, I didn't have enough money. There's no time. They don't want to let me have the lights I want, the lenses I want. We can't afford anything." If you prep and you prepare yourself, and you prepare yourself in the box of what the production is, because they don't say there is no money just because there's no money. They say because there's a budget and it's a real thing. But you can work with them. You can work with the production manager or with the line producer, and you can say, well, I went through the script, and actually I need the crane for 3 specific days, because the crane is telling a particular type of thing within the story. And that's when I really want it. And that line producer will respect that, because they will say, oh, he really did his homework. And if you are the person who is like, well, I just need crane all the time because I don't know when I might use it, they'll say, oh, no, there's no money. But if you're prepared and come up with a plan, they will try to figure out how to help you find the money. And usually you can. Usually you can kind of get, even with a limited budget, you can get all the tools that you need to effectively tell the story.
Fantastic. I'd like at this point to bring some questions from our audience forward. Jeff, if you could read us a question from someone.
Sure. We had a couple questions regarding your opinion, Peter, on large format versus shooting Super 35. Obviously, since you've shot Venice recently, could you speak to that in your opinion, please?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think large format is a wonderful tool. I think the big difference that I see in large format is being able to. I like to shoot live. I like to see the world. I use tight lenses for specific things, but usually I want to see where we are and why we are there. And I think in the big, wide shots, the image is just so much clearer, particularly on the sides. So for a large format, I think it's quite beautiful. The one reason, a lot of people will say, well, you should just shoot large format or you should shoot 6K is because then you can sort of zoom in and chop it however you want. And, it's a really tricky place to be as a cinematographer, because then, you're kind of handing that over to an editor or to a post-production person to slice your image the way they need. Of course, if you're doing a VFX movie that needs that, it's an amazing tool because they can get to, wherever they need to. But, it's a tough place because, yes, you want to give everybody the better image, but then you're, in some cases, giving up control. And, I think that's kind of a bigger conversation. But, I have been, I did a project in January where we sort of said, let's just shoot in a 35 sensor because we don't really need to be large format. And then we sort of did some tests and we realized, oh my God, it just looks so much better. There's a breadth, there is a fullness to the image. The edges are clear and it feels like you're sort of in there more. So I enjoy it. I think it's a really, really good tool to have, if you can do it. And the one thing, actually, I spoke to a friend of mine last night. I think large format also gives us many more options when it comes to lens choices. There's many, really great lenses now, like the signatures, the S7s, Panavision lenses. I know some people have been using 35 millimeter lenses on large format because even though they were not really designed for large format, they actually fit and they have interesting effects that happen because of that. It is, I think, ultra primes, almost all ultra primes, all the way down to like somewhere in the 20s you can use on a large format camera, and it gives you kind of a cool look. So if that's the look that your story demands, it's just more options. Go for it.
The next one is sort of a two-part question from two different people, but kind of relates to what you were saying earlier about your experience with documentaries. So what are some ways you would say your documentary influences your narrative approach? And also, would you say the creative approach between the two, scripted versus narrative, is dramatically different when in terms of crafting the look?
Okay, so I think certainly my years of carrying the camera on my shoulder and filming real things and real people in real situations, has had an influence on the way I shoot fiction, because, the way I see the light, the way I see the movement, the way I kind of see if things look staged. Sometimes it's difficult because you have to bring that up with the director and say, look, I don't really believe that this person would just stand there the whole time. I think in real life they would pace around because of what is happening in the story. I think it goes back to that idea of that my camera tends to always kind of discover things and see where the emotions are and all of that. And so it's influenced me that way. What I do, I probably do, because I'm always like, well, this shouldn't be like a documentary. I do all that extra prep beforehand to make sure that I'm really ready in this sort of fiction world. And then what happens on set, those two things kind of marry themselves together, and it becomes maybe what might be a little bit of a unique style. And what's the other part of the question?
The second part of that question was, is the creative approach dramatically different between non-scripted versus narrative when crafting the look?
Yeah, I think it's quite different. I think on a documentary, you're usually privileged to, some kind of a conversation with a director, reading an article about the subject, maybe watching another film, and then you kind of go to capture it. I mean, you can discuss about, do you want this to be wider, tighter? Are we doing a very tight documentary? Is this a lot of sitting down? Do you want to move the camera a lot? Do you want to follow the character, or do you want to just kind of observe them from a distance? But there are sort of basic set of rules that you said before, and then you sort of go and execute them. In film, because of the prep and because of the script, at least I really want to know what I'm doing in quite a bit of a detail before I get there. If the style is that what I'm doing is following the action in a documentary-like shooting style, that's what the shooting style is going to be. But I know that that's what I want to do. And if that style then changes because I want to put the camera far away and shoot with a foreground to make it look like someone's watching, to give you that sensation, then I'll do that. So the prep is just much more specific in fiction. And it should you should see, you should see what then happens in the movie, and hopefully it comes as close to sort of the reality of the situation as possible.
Sure. Speaking to your experience on The Amazing Race, with minimal crew and on such remote locations, we're sure there's a bunch of nightmare scenarios that you had to face. Were there any particularly unique or memorable ones that you'd like to share?
Well, look, none of my experiences are nightmare. I always look at work and at life as just a kind of a gift, and every experience always just makes you stronger. Have we had? I mean, there was one time we were shooting in Arles in southern France. No, it wasn't in Arles. It was in, or maybe it was. Yes, it was. It was in Arles. And we're shooting in a Roman Colosseum, and we had a slider set up, and then Phil is kind of walking down this little steps, and we had it all beautifully set up, and a couple of Roman soldiers walking this way, and the lighting was just about perfect, and then we're doing the shot, and we're all really happy, and we're thinking like, we might have time to grab a quick espresso on the way out, and all of a sudden the call comes into the phone or the message like the team is on the way to the pit stop. Like, what do you mean the team is on the way to the pit stop? Is that possible? So we're like, well, we gotta go. So just drop everything because we have to beat the team. We have to be there. He has to stand there before the team gets there. And we realize we don't have time to go in our van. So we have to go with the host, with Phil. It just happens to be that for some reason the driver, who is Phil's driver, that episode is a race car driver who is driving an Alfa Romeo. So Phil, me, and the sound guy pile into this car, this Alfa Romeo, and we're driving on these tiny little French roads. And as it turns out, about a kilometer before the pit stop, before this villa, we see the team in front of us. And I swear, if it wasn't for a race car driver, I'm sure we broke all the rules. We would have never passed them, but we passed them, jump out of the car, run to the pit stop, and there they come, and we're acting like nothing happened, and we're just right there. So it wasn't a nightmare. It was fun, and we made it.
What are you, Peter? Do you have a preference, or do you wish to operate your own camera most times, or do you like to have a camera operator and be more of the lighting DP? Obviously, in scenarios with Amazing Race, you're doing everything. But I'm wondering, in narratives, you give that choice, do you like to have that relationship of physically having the camera in your hand?
Generally, I do. Generally, I like to operate my own camera, particularly when it's handheld. Handheld is a really difficult technique to convey to somebody else, because it's about the way you move, the way your body functions, because your body becomes part of the camera. Mm-hmm. I've certainly done things where I had operators on things that are more set up. I think the biggest thing with having an operator is, you have one more creative partner in your team, which is great. And the other thing, it frees you up to sort of see more of the bigger picture and be more of the lighting VP. But generally, I operate my own camera. There were a couple of times where I was like, "Oh, well, we'll get an operator," and the directors are like, "No, what are you talking about? Like, I want you to operate the camera. That's why I have you." So, yeah. But probably as I get older, I'll use more operators as I go.
Jeff, I believe there's more questions coming in.
Yes, Peter, do you have any painting references that you refer to in your work, or painters, I should say?
Yeah, absolutely. It's specific to whatever the movie it is. Let's say lately I've been, I'm a big fan of Kazimir Malevich, which is a Russian painter from the 1920s in Russia. It's a very abstract type of painting. So let's say that I'm doing a movie that the character is constantly looking inside and sort of doesn't see the world the way that everybody else sees. I would use abstract paintings for that reference, Malevich or maybe Kandinsky. If it's a darker movie, I'll go to Dutch painters from the 17th century, or I'll go to Caravaggio or something like that. But I'll always try to be specific about what that is. And what I think helps is to just go to a gallery or to a museum and get inspired. Before the movie, after you really know the script, because then the script speaks to whatever that emotion is. And I've discovered completely random paintings that are from unknown painters that spoke to me the best at places in Georgia, in China, whatever it might be.
Peter, I have a question, and that is, what is your feeling? We got to keep this a little brief, but generally, what is your feeling about different types of camera movement? In other words, what criteria do you set in your mind as, I'm going to use a Steadicam or I'm going to use a gimbal? Where you want to introduce movement like that, where it's a choreographed, rehearsed thing, where do you make that call as to the camera movement device, I should say?
Well, it would have to do with what's happening in the story and what's happening in the emotion. I mean, there is two types of movements that you have in film, and one is the movement of the actors, and one is the movement of the camera. And the movement, the actor or the character might never move; they might sit still all the time. Then, does it make sense to shake the camera around them, or move the camera in crazy circles around them? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. So I kind of try to balance those two things, and I usually have quite extensive conversations with the director about what the movement of the actors is going to be. For example, in Tamara, we sort of designed the scenes the way that, where are the actors going to be for their particular lines? Do they come towards the camera? Do they stay away from the camera? How do they relate to to the other person. One of my teachers said, when you're photographing a relationship between two characters, when you're photographing two characters, you're photographing the relationship between two characters. Let's find it. And I think the movement is a great tool in finding those relationships. You know, Steadicam is like a particular feeling. It's sort of like almost a force of God is pushing the camera, and I think that should reflect the emotion that the character is going through. So I wouldn't use a Steadicam for every scene. I wouldn't use it in a playground where everybody's happy and all of that. But I might use it for the moment that they get a phone call that their relative has died, and I might walk away with them and have that force, like the world is sort of just, they're not in control of their own destiny, and the Steadicam might mean that in my movie, or it could be the opposite. Handheld. I often see handheld use whenever there is drama, and I always kind of question it, because it's sort of like, okay, there's some kind of a drama, and we decided to shake the camera just to sort of show that there is drama. Well, there could be a lot of different ways to tell that, than to just arbitrarily go for that look. So movement is, again, I think if it's specific, and we make rules to what the specific things are in our film, it's a very powerful tool, just like all the other ones, just like lighting, just like lenses, just like space.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. Jeff, can you?
Sure. The last question then would be a little bit more general. What advice would you give an aspiring cinematographer?
I would say look for your opportunities. There is a lot of them. Once you decide to go for an opportunity, do the best you can. Don't make excuses to say that I couldn't, or it's not quite right, or I don't have the money, or whatever it is. Just go for it and tackle it. Full on. And one big advice, I think, is just be nice. Be nice to people on set. Be nice to people around you. Be nice to your crew. I have two rules on set: no running, no yelling. And I feel like if people are yelling or running, I'm doing something wrong on my set, because the atmosphere shouldn't demand that. It shouldn't be needed. So I think being nice goes a long way, because you never know, next time that who you're working with, and it's you don't know, who is going to hire you next, and it's just the right thing to do. There's no reason to not be nice. I have one maybe example that would speak to that. I took drawing lessons when I was at AFI, outside of AFI, because I'm terrible at drawing and I'm terrible at storyboard. So I just wanted to be a little bit better at storyboard. So I would, in between classes at AFI, if I had 2 hours, I would drive to Monterey Park in east part of Los Angeles, and go to a park and sit on a bench and just draw with this Chinese drawing teacher, kind of a younger guy who was in school. And we did it, 4 or 5 times. And then I completely forgot because I got too busy. And 10 years later, or 8 years later, I get this Facebook message, "Happy birthday," from somebody who had a Chinese name. And I forgot that this was Jeremy. And I said, "Oh, okay." And he said, "Oh, I don't know if you remember me, but I was this kid who used to teach you how to draw in Monterey Park. And I've since returned to China and actually became a successful director. And I've been following your career over the last few years, and I think I'm ready to hire you as a DP on my next movie. Would you be interested in coming to China?" And I was like, "Yeah, of course, I'd be happy to." And we did. We made a really cool little comedy on this little island in southern China.
Oh, that's terrific. So we have come to the end of our conversation with Peter. Peter, thank you so much for sharing your insights and your knowledge and your experience with us. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for this conversation today. We look forward to seeing you again on future broadcasts. Thank you so much, and be safe and have a great day.
Yeah, and anytime people want to contact me, I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm very liberal with all of my knowledge. Whatever I know, whatever little it is, I'm happy to share. So, people have my email, whatever they want to do with it. Please feel free to contact me.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.